Welcome back. President Cyril Ramaphosa signed the minimum wage bill into law last week. It comes into effect from the 1st of January next year, but not all businesses will be able to afford the wage hike, and some might be forced to retrench staff, something that could go against the bill's intention of bridging the inequality gap in South Africa. So how can organizations find a balance? Let's find out from Tebogo Moalusi, National Industrial Relations Director at Workforce Staffing. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. So it is a difficult one because during the discussions at NEDLAC, many companies raise concerns that they won't be able to afford this increase. They might have to retrench staff. How do you strike a balance?
It's a difficult balance to perhaps strike, if I can perhaps put it in that fashion. On the one hand, if the minimum wage is too high, businesses might struggle to afford it. It could push them to actually embark on retrenchment processes. And if it's too low, it would compromise perhaps the employees who might feel like the minimum wage is perhaps nothing which perhaps caters for them. Therefore, it's important, perhaps, with the current minimum wage, that businesses develop approaches which perhaps can assist them in terms of avoiding retrenchments. Because the natural response to an increase in the wage bill is perhaps to retrench. Therefore, it's critical that one looks at specific options that might be there. One being maybe using flexibility and ensuring that you use staff at the right time. So for all intents and purposes, if you're going through your peaks, use your staff for those peaks, and when you go down, because when you're going through your less productive peaks, you use less staff, and you can use a temporary employment service to do all that, as opposed to employing the employees permanently.
But ultimately, that means that people are still going to lose their jobs, because if you use people on and off, that means a permanent job is something that they will lose. Government was very strong-handed with this particular point, saying that companies can actually ease themselves into it and prepare for it, because these talks were happening for such a long time. Is that the reality, though?
Right. I think that there's two issues. I think the first thing is that obviously the government gave us the exemption, but we must understand that the exemption is only 90% of the actual minimum wage for the different industries. So for some businesses, it might still be difficult to cope. The reason why I mentioned a temporary employment service provider is the essence in which the system works. For all intents and purposes, for workforce staffing, if you have an employee working in a certain client, as soon as perhaps there's no work for them, they can be moved to another location whereby they can still work, as opposed to embarking on a retrenchment.
And then looking at whether people can actually say, well, you're going to agree to work for me at a lower rate. We're going to work outside of this. Is that something that can happen where workers would rather agree to a lower salary than lose their jobs altogether?
Well, it wouldn't be the correct approach. More than anything else, the minimum wage is here and here to stay. It's something that you need to comply with. So whether an employee agrees to say, listen, I'll take wages which are lower than the minimum wage, it wouldn't be correct, and perhaps you'll be breaching legislation.
What happens to people like domestic workers, farm workers, I saw? That's a different level altogether, because there are different standards set out for that. But eventually, do we see them get on to the same minimum wage that has been set out, or not?
So the way the legislature has been perhaps put forward is that it's going to be reviewed within an 18-month period. Therefore, we might see a change in terms of what the minimum wage is, because after the 18 months, there's going to be an analysis as to perhaps how many jobs have been lost and whether is this minimum wage perhaps acceptable. So there might be a change as things go along for the different industries, as well as for the general broad 20 Rand for all the other industries.
Well, that's it, the blanket approach that was taken. The consequences of that will be seen after 18 months, as you mentioned. Is that the right approach when we already have an economy that's losing jobs so dramatically right now?
You know, I think more than anything else, if you look at the minimum wage, it's the right way to go. If, for all intents and purposes, we didn't have a minimum wage, we would continue with workers perhaps earning the bare minimum. However, as business, for business and labor, if we work together and ensure that we make sure that this transition works and perhaps happens as smoothly as possible, by perhaps not having a zonal view, but perhaps having a broader view of things and trying to perhaps find solutions, it can make a very good, or perhaps a very positive difference for, one, the economy, and perhaps workers as well as business.
Reality-wise, though, let's talk about businesses who are going to come and say, well, we can't afford this, we're going to have to retrench workers. What then? What does government do, and what does the business sector do in that regard?
Yeah, perhaps for all intents and purposes, yes, the day might come whereby the business perhaps needs to look at retrenching. My view is that that shouldn't be the last resort. Businesses need to dig deeper. You cannot perhaps have a one-way view of things. There's many things that one can consider. You can look at things such as overtime. As I said, you can look at flexibility and perhaps take your shift patterns. And like I say, the use of a temporary employment service is something that's critical. The most key thing is that you use a credible temporary employment service provider. And if you look at all those options, you might be able to minimize retrenchments.
So let's talk about the overtime example that you listed here in this email to us. Just explain how you think it should work.
All right. So for all intents and purposes, certain businesses perhaps would have excessive overtime because it wouldn't be managed properly. But however, if you pay a close eye in terms of your productivity, your requirements, your full business analysis, one can manage it much better as opposed to spending a big wage bill on overtime.
So it really is about being smarter ultimately in how you pay workers and your workforce. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. That was Tebogo Moalusi, National Industrial Relations Director at Workforce Staffing. Now, the